Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History, and I am joined by Kevin Chu, the Assistant Director of Collections at the Museum of Chinese in America. And he and I were the co-curators of an exhibition called An Unlikely Photojournalist, Emile Bocian in Chinatown, which is currently available online. You can find a link to it at the top of the center's webpage, cjh.org. And Bocian was the son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, which explains the connection to the Center for Jewish History. We are also joined today by two of Emile Bocian's relatives, his grandniece, Jocelyn Kaplan, and his nephew, Frank Bocian. And we're going to start off with a conversation with Jocelyn and Frank about their family history and their relations with their uncle. And then Kevin will speak a bit about the history of the Bocian collection at MOCA. I'll talk about how we put the exhibition together and show you some images from that. And after that, we'll open it up to Q&A. You'll notice that the chat box is closed off, so please put all of your questions in the Q&A. You can ask them as we go along, and we'll get to as many as we can later. So with that, let's get into the conversation. I'm going to move on to a family tree that Kevin put together while he was doing his research into the family.
So I guess I can talk a little bit about kind of this family tree. This family tree was put together while I was kind of going through Emile's belongings, and this was kind of done before I met Jocelyn or Frank. But after talking to Frank, the family tree is a lot bigger than this, but this is what it turned out as when I was kind of researching at the beginning. And so you could see where Jocelyn is and where Frank is on the family tree. So we'll just circle those for you, and you can see kind of their relation to each other. And I guess we can start by Frank. I know you've done a little bit of research about your family history. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of your last name? So you pronounce it Bocian, but there's three different pronunciations. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Well, the name means stork in Polish, and I think the correct Polish pronunciation is Bocian. But I think my grandparents and most of the family pronounce it as Bocian. Somehow over the years, it became Bocian on my side of the family. Although interestingly, my brother still pronounces it as Bocian. Harris and Eva Bocian came to New York in 1904, and they arrived with three children. The oldest was Lillian, who is Jocelyn's grandmother, and the only girl in the family. And the second was Sam, and the third was my father, Meyer, who was 2 years old at the time. They came from a town in northeastern Poland called Lumja, although in Polish they pronounce it Łomża. And it was the site of a fairly well-known Talmudic academy, a yeshiva. And the story that I heard was that my grandfather Harris was a full-time student, a full-time scholar there, and was in fact supported by his father-in-law, whose name was Silverberg. And so when he came to this country, he really had no profession other than being a scholar, and became a paper hanger.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here and show this petition for naturalization. When we were doing research into the family, we brought up some documents from the genealogical databases. And this is Harris's petition for naturalization, showing that he was born in Łomża and that his occupation is paper hanger, and also listing the 6 children, the first 3 who were born in Russia, and the youngest 3 who were all born in New York, including Emile, who at that point was named Emmanuel. You can see 1912, Emmanuel. We don't know when or why he changed his name, but it's important that he was born in New York because that'll come up in a little bit. Jocelyn, can you talk a little bit about what you remember about Emile? I know you said he used to visit your family on holidays like Passover. Can you just share a couple of memories of that?
Sure. Uncle Emile would, and by the way, I always knew him as Emile Bocian, but everyone has their pronunciations. In any case, Uncle Emile did not have a car. He would take the Long Island Railroad out, there, a picture of mom and dad. And he would take the Long Island Railroad out to visit our family for holidays. And these holidays always included family meals. He always wore a bow tie and his round glasses. And he always had a camera around his neck. We fortunately have some fabulous family pictures that he took when he would come to visit. He also would bring me fantastic toys. I remember an erector set, racing cars, and electric trains. And I love these toys, ones that my parents would never have given to their daughter. There was really something magical about my Uncle Emile.
Kevin?
Yeah, thanks, Jocelyn. So I guess kind of going on Emile and kind of his whole family history. I know there was kind of a rift in the family because of business disputes, and Frank, you kind of didn't see that side of the family too much, but you did meet Emile on a couple of occasions. Can you talk about kind of what you remember when you met with him?
As Jocelyn said, I remember him with a bow tie and big round glasses. I remember him as being tall and slim and always very funny, always making jokes. And he kind of reminded me of Danny Kaye. That's sort of how I thought of him. There was a rift, but we did see Lou and Milton and Emile from time to time on rare occasions. I sort of feel bad about that because I didn't get to know well that side of the family. That's why I'm so pleased to have met Jocelyn.
And Jocelyn, your mother, Adeline, was Emile's niece, but as you mentioned, there was only 10 years between them. So can you tell us a little bit about their relationship and what she told you about him?
Sure. Well, Emile came, as Frank mentioned, from a family of 6 children. 3 were born in Poland and the rest in the United States. The oldest child was Lillian, and that was my mom's mom, and the youngest was Emile. Since Lillian was tasked with taking care of her younger brothers, she was eager to marry and move out. And she eloped at age 18. Her second child was my mom, Adeline. And since Emile was the youngest of the 6 children, mom was only 10 years younger than Emile, so they really were in the same generation. And they would attend dances together. And Emile would always pull my mom aside and remind her not to call him uncle. Another story that mom told me about Uncle Emile was that one of his first jobs was to entice people to smoke cigarettes by handing out free cigarettes. And he gave a cigarette to my mom to try. Well, when her mom, Lillian, found out that Emile had given a cigarette to her daughter, he was in trouble. But that was the beginning of his PR career.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And I know you said Emile was your favorite uncle, and you used to meet with him in Chinatown when you got older. And you said you had lunch with him on some occasions and also visited his apartment. Can you talk a little bit about what you remember from those visits?
I can. And I can also was reminded by my sister just recently that it was my mom, my sister, and I who went to his apartment in Confucius Plaza to clear it out. And that apartment was stuffed to the gills. And there was some beautiful furniture, much of which I inherited, but boxes and boxes of stuff, which Kevin, you've come to know intimately from what was actually saved. And I actually just read something that you had written, Kevin, saying that Uncle Emile lived in Confucius Plaza, which was an apartment building exclusively for Chinese Americans. But apparently Mei Wang, and she's an important character in this story, she had worked with a Congressman, John Murphy, who was able to help Emile file the paperwork to get a studio apartment in the complex. And he lived in apartment 30J until his death in 1990 at the age of 78. So he was really sort of an insider and an outsider when it came to Chinatown. He lived there, he worked there, he took photos. People knew of him, but never knew him well.
You told us just a story about people coming up to you in the restaurants.
Yes, and so we actually met with him on another occasion where he took us to a toy show. Did I mention that? And the National Toy Show. And there was also another occasion where a friend of mine had a Chinese sculptor who was visiting from China, and we met Uncle Emile with that person. And then we all went out to lunch together, and people would walk by the table and they would nod at him. It wasn't ever verbal, it was just a nod that they knew who he was. But as I mentioned, he really was an outsider, even though he lived in Chinatown.
It reminds me of a quote from one of his letters talking about the work he was doing for the China Post. He said, "I don't get paid much, but I get a lot of free dinners."
Exactly. And that was true when he would come to visit us at our house for the holidays. There was always food involved, but that's a Jewish thing.
So the two of you didn't really know each other prior to a few months ago until Kevin reached out for the purposes of this event. So can you talk about what this has been like for you, finding this other branch of your family tree and learning about the exhibit?
Well, for me, it's a surprise because we had such a small family. My mom had one sister who was disabled, and so she never married or had kids. So I had no cousins on that side. And we saw Emile. Occasionally we would see one of the other brothers, but for the most part, there was very little family on my mother's side. So to me, this is a great and wonderful surprise to actually be reunited with a cousin, someone who I didn't know. And, I had heard when I grew up about the fact that there was some kind of family rift, but no one was ever specific about it. So as a child, you don't ask more questions, you just take it for granted. So it's been kind of fun because now Franklin and I have had the opportunity to talk on the phone several times, and he gives me information about things and people that I never knew about. And hopefully I've been able to share some fun things for him as well.
Right. I feel very much the same way. Even though they had, Harris and Eva had 6 children, because 3 of the boys, we used to call them, 3 of the boys never married, or one married very late in life. There were actually very few grandchildren. There were my brother, my sister, and I, and Jocelyn and her sister, who are great-grandchildren. And then Sam had 2 daughters who were also grandchildren, but so it was really just very few. And so it is, even though it started out as a kind of a big family of 6 children, it sort of ended up as a rather small family. So getting to know Jocelyn, for me, has been a treat.
Right. They were always referred to as the bachelor uncles. And actually, up until recently, I thought, aside from one, that they were all bachelor uncles, which of course is not the case because here you are.
But we refer to them as the boys.
The boys.
So yes, Emile never married and never had children.
That's correct.
And that's also true of Milton and Lewis, who were the other 2 born in New York.
But Lewis married ultimately, but did not have children. But much
Lewis
later in life.
Right. Lewis married at 65 to a woman who was 63.
Isn't that amazing?
Kevin, did you want to move into the next section?
I just have one follow-up kind of to this. So I guess prior to this, me reaching out to you, did you know that Emile was a big photographer, and did you think that his photos would be so kind of influential? How do you feel about the show, and kind of what does the show mean to you and your legacy as a family?
I didn't know. I mean, I knew that he had worked for the China Post and that he lived in Chinatown. I sort of knew that he had, I heard the story that he had kind of been a liaison between the Chinese community and the police department, and that was something that the Chinese community appreciated. I didn't know the extent of the photographs, and I think that's fabulous. And I'm just thrilled with this exhibit.
And what's so interesting about my Uncle Emile is that he never owned a car. He was very tall with long legs, And he was a high energy guy and always on the move. And he walked everywhere. And he always had that heavy camera around his neck. When he came to visit us on Long Island, or when I met him in the city, and other pictures that I've seen, he always had the camera. And that's how he came to be able to take these photos of situations that he might have just come upon, that he hadn't been hired to take these photos, but he was just walking around because he always had the camera. And what's so interesting is that when he took the photos, he didn't see what they looked like. It's only today that we have our cell phones. We take a picture, we have an instant gratification. We actually can see the result. He would take the pictures and then he would have to go home and he would have the negatives, some of which got developed, many of which never got developed. So it's really a historical view of photography, in addition to a historical view of the person who took the photos, because it's so different today.
Well, that's a good segue into your section, Kevin.
So I guess I'll talk about kind of how I came to look into this collection and kind of what, I guess how it started. So the photo you see now is of Muhammad Ali, and he's in Chinatown. And the guy on the right is MB Lee. He was the president of CCBA in the 70s. CCBA stands for Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association. They helped like recent immigrants kind of get acclimated to American life. But this was the photo I kind of first saw when I first started interning at the museum in about 2014, I believe. And I was always kind of a fan of boxing, and it was weird to kind of find a picture of Muhammad Ali in Chinatown, because I never actually heard him that he went to Chinatown, or I didn't know he had any involvement in the Chinese community. And so I kind of started wondering why he was there and who took this photo, because it's a pretty good photo. It's not like a far away photo. It's a close-up shot. So he definitely had some sort of press credentials or something. So I started kind of looking into it because the collection was so big. If you can go to the next slide, Lauren. And so this is the collection after we kind of had a chance to organize it. When I first kind of saw it, it was in like cigar boxes and old like moving boxes. And we actually received a grant to process them and kind of organize them. And what you see is kind of just a portion of the collection. His collection contains over about 85,000 or more negatives and photos. So the things you see on the left are little envelopes, and each envelope has like maybe 10, 15 negatives inside. And the boxes on the right are actual developed photos that he actually printed. And there aren't really duplicates. So the negatives, we kind of had to go through each one to see the differences. And that's kind of just to give you an idea of the scope of his entire collection. And he also had some memorabilia that is not here, but he collected like paper materials and just like research he did throughout the community while he was kind of working at the China Post. I guess based on his collection, it's kind of an interesting journey. So with the show, we kind of focused mainly on his time in Chinatown. But if you really think about it, his Chinatown was like a lot of like his twilight years he spent in Chinatown. But earlier, he actually started kind of as a comedy writer. He tried his hand at comedy writing, didn't really go anywhere. He wrote like maybe 2 articles for like a comedy publication. And then in the 1950s, he kind of started working with Waldo Mayo, who was a famous violinist. I think you guys probably know his sister better. Her name's Lucille Lortel. She was an actress, I believe. And she's more well-known than he was, but she has a scholarship for a violinist at Carnegie Hall in Waldo Mayo's honor. But he worked at this PR firm for a while. And the photo on the left looks like a mugshot, but it's not. Emile wasn't arrested or anything. It seems like it was something that the PR firm kind of did with some of their employees as kind of a joke or something. I don't know the context, but it definitely was not a real like mugshot. The one in the middle is Waldo Mayo, and the one on the right is kind of some of the girls he worked with when he was doing the Miss Dairy Queen PR campaign for Waldo Mayo. And I think those were some of the girls that he worked with. And a lot of the people he knew later on he kept in touch with were people he met through kind of working PR at Waldo Mayo. And he eventually opened his own PR firm, Emile Bocian and Associates, which I'll talk a little bit about later. One of the people that he stayed in touch with was this mentalist named Canasta. He was actually Polish too, and I think that might have been how they kind of stayed together. They kind of kept in touch. But you can kind of find some of his videos on YouTube. He's actually well known in the magician community. He doesn't like to be called a magician. He wanted to be called a mentalist, but his kind of whole shtick was he would like tell people to pick cards and he would guess their cards. And the whole thing that the magic community likes about him is that he used to make mistakes on purpose to kind of bring in the realism that it wasn't some sort of magic trick that he planned in advance. And the reason why I bring him up is if you look on the right, you can kind of see all these letters. And these are letters between Chan and Emile from about 1976 to 77. So over the course of about a year, they corresponded very regularly. And the interesting thing is Emile liked to keep everything. Like Jocelyn said, he had boxes of everything. And the thing with these letters is he photocopied the letters he wrote to Chan. So we could interestingly follow this conversation that the two had over the course of about a year. And that's kind of how we got a lot of the information for the show. It was through these letters. And I'll talk a little bit about the letters later, but I also talked to Chan's wife, who's still alive. And she said she did come to New York, but never met Emile. And she doesn't know why, because Chan introduced him to a lot of friends. And so I don't know if they had a falling out at some point, because there's nothing past the 77 in letters. And so I don't know where their relationship went, but that's something that's kind of interesting to think about. And so this is kind of how he gets to Chinatown, and this is kind of how the exhibition, this will lead into kind of more of the exhibition stuff. So I mentioned before he kind of did, he started his own PR firm, Emile Bocian and Associates. You can see on the left side, that envelope, it actually says Emile Bocian and Associates. It's a little bit, depending on how big your screen is, you might be able to read it. But his first thing was kind of doing PR for the Swiss Sky Ride at the World's Fair in 1964-65. And then eventually he met this guy named Stephen Chang, who's actually in the picture on the left. And he's most well known for actually a Jamaican rocksteady song that he recorded in Jamaica. And if you're like a music buff, I think people actually like thought this was really interesting. And this is actually kind of like a pretty famous song. But at some point he wanted to do this variety show, kind of akin to like Sonny and Cher or something like that. And he came to Emile to kind of push this show in Chinatown because Emile did PR. I don't think he had any associations with Chinatown at this point, but he started doing PR for Stephen Chang in Chinatown, and he met Mei Wang, who's actually in the picture on the right. I believe she's the second from the left. And she was actually head of Chinatown, I think, Planning Council, and they ran this Miss Chinatown pageant, and it's still running today. And she was kind of running that pageant. And Emile went to her to try and get like Stephen on the show or things like that. And they became friends actually. So that's kind of where Mei Wang kind of plays into this. I spoke to her. She couldn't be here today, but basically she said when she met Emile, she told him about the pageant, and Emile used his connections to get like American news outlets to come, like CBS, NBC. And she said like all of them showed up while she was prepping for the pageant the day of. And she thought it was some kind of joke, and she was stressed out, and she told them all to go away. So they didn't actually get to cover this event. And she said, I think she said it was kind of something she regretted not letting them do because it would have bought more publicity.
Of course.
But her and Emile kind of became friends after that. And she was an ensemble dancer for in Flower Drum Song on Broadway. And she was the one that ended up ultimately donating the photos to us. She held on to them until MOCA could take them. And I know, Jocelyn, you kind of mentioned to me a little bit about how your mother and May kind of met and the photos, kind of how they changed hands. Do you want to talk a little bit about that real quick?
Well, as I said, Mom was the executor of the estate and came into this small apartment. It was just a studio apartment with furniture and lots of stuff, which of course you've seen how many boxes we're talking about. And she didn't really know what to do with all of these boxes. And apparently the connection was with Mei Wang, who had helped him get into the building, and they were friends. And so she volunteered to take all of these boxes, which she did. And then I think then ultimately they moved from one place to another, and then ultimately they made it to the museum.
Yeah. She said she kept them in like PTA rooms in the basements of schools that she was at, and eventually she was able to donate it to us. Because originally when she first offered it to MOCA, we were a small institution and we didn't have space for that many boxes. And eventually, when we did actually expand, we were able to take them all in, and luckily we were able to save them and save all these like images of Chinatown that would have maybe disappeared. he got the China Post kind of in, this is all according to him. There's no, I guess there's no way to kind of figure it out because we couldn't track down the owner of the China Post. But after he met Mei Wang, he was kind of in Chinatown promoting Stephen Chang, and he met the owner of Pagoda Theater. His name was Lucas Liang, and he met this guy. And at the time, they were coming, a unknown movie called Fists of Fury, starring Bruce Lee, was coming to the U.S. and it was going to, I think, premiere at the Pagoda Theater. And so Lucas kind of tasked Emile with kind of running the publicity for Fist of Fury. And if you could see in the letter on the left, that's when he wrote to Chan. If you look at the highlighted yellow, he talks about how good of a job he did on the PR campaign for Fist of Fury. And on the right is actually paperwork for the publicity campaign he ran for Fist of Fury. And if you look at it, it's not really that impressive. If you guys just want to take a look at kind of what he did, kind of what he kind of rented out, it doesn't seem like it was something. And Emile was kind of known for telling these tall tales. Like, I actually spoke to a tennis player that he photographed, and she said he used to always tell him that his father discovered Neil Diamond, which is definitely not the case. But he used to always say things like that, and he was always someone for kind of telling tall tales. And so he said he did such a good job that the owner of the theater also owned the China Post, and he asked Emile if he would stay on and do publicity for the paper. And that's kind of how he ended up at China Post. And this is where kind of him telling tall tales comes in. So the big map on the right is of China, and the thing that's circled is Kaifang. And the significance of Kaifang is kind of, if you look on the letter, he said he had a hard time kind of getting inroads with the Chinese community because they were always kind of suspicious of why someone that was non-Chinese, didn't speak a word of Chinese, wanted to help this community that was generally neglected. And so in the letter, he tells Chan that he used to tell them that he had family roots in this Chinese town called Kaifang, which is historically known to have a Jewish population and be a pretty big Jewish community in China. And so I put it on the map because I think it's kind of hard, like you wouldn't know where it is, but if you look on the top, Beijing is to the north and Shanghai is to the east. So it's kind of in the middle of there. And I guess going on that story, Frank actually has an anecdote kind of about Emile's kind of tall tales about being from China.
When I was in practice, I was an ophthalmologist. A patient came to my office one day and asked if I was related to Emile Bocian. And I said, yes, he's my uncle. And this gentleman said, what a fascinating man he is, a French Jew born in Shanghai. And when I came home and I said to my dad, gee, I heard that Emile was a French Jew born in Shanghai. My dad said, well, if there's an Essex Street in Shanghai, then that's true.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, and so he kind of just always told these tall tales, so it's kind of hard to decipher what was the truth, because he was always an eternal PR man. Like, eternally, that seemed to be his vocation forever.
I'm going to talk for a bit about how this exhibit came about. So, how does the Center for Jewish History fit into all of this? So this exhibit grew out of a collaboration between the two organizations. As early as 2018, there were talks between the two museums about ways to collaborate in general, and it resulted in a shared grant for digitizing hidden collections, in this case of the shared Jewish and Chinese immigrant and refugee experience. And we were awarded that grant together in January of 2019, and that is still ongoing. But it was during all the discussions around that center staff learned about the existence of this collection, and talks started between us about how we could make an exhibit happen, because they had the collection, we had the space and the ability to mount it, and of course the interest due to the crossover subject matter, and we wanted to keep our collaboration going. So the exhibit itself, as a physical exhibit at the center, was ready to be installed in late March, early April of 2020, which wasn't great timing, as you know, because right after the world had shut down. So we still plan to install it as a physical exhibition once we reopen and it's safe to do so. But as the pandemic was dragging on, we decided we really wanted to get this exhibit and these pictures out there to the public. So some of our center staff did a really good job translating the physical exhibit into an online exhibition. which you can see. It's a link from our homepage at cjh.org. I won't have the time to take you through the complete exhibit, which would take some time. And also, I hope it's something that you would do at your leisure. But I am going to talk briefly about how we organize the exhibit and some of the themes that we came up with to try to, create some order out of the chaos. Basically, there are two main strands, and the first is about Bocian himself and his life, how he ended up living in Chinatown and working for the China Post. But Kevin has already covered a lot of that, as have Frank and Jocelyn. So I'm going to focus more on the second strand, which is about Chinatown itself and how it's depicted in the photo archive. So I'll talk a little about that and show you a few representative images from each section. We start the exhibition with the section called Then and Now. Mei Wang, who, as you know, donated the collection to MOCA, told Kevin that Bocian told her he hoped to return in the future to document the changes in the neighborhood over time. And he didn't have a chance to do that in his own lifetime. So we thought it made sense to do that for him. So the center's art director went down to Chinatown last winter to recreate some shots from the same vantage point of some, well-known locations in Chinatown. And in some cases, we were struck really by how little has changed. As one of the last neighborhoods in the city to undergo gentrification, Chinatown still boasts many of its original structures. In some cases, as in here, even both, containing the same business as in Bocian's day. Certain things have changed, the upstairs tenant and the guys wearing suits, and you don't see a lot of guys wearing suits anymore. But things are pretty much the same. I should point out that all this was done pre-COVID, and Chinatown was hit very hard and earlier than the rest of the city, even before the citywide shutdown, mainly because of racism and xenophobia. And many, many Chinatown businesses, even more so than elsewhere across New York City, have closed. Particularly the restaurants who rely on foot traffic from the nearby financial center and courthouses. So they're going through a hard time. As far as I know, Namwa is still hanging in there, but there are other photos in the Then and Now series where, as of early 2020, a longtime business was still there and had been there in Bocian's day, and now it is not, unfortunately. I'm going to show you one more from this Then and Now series, an example of where gentrification has, taken its toll. You see on the left the Silver Palace restaurant, which was torn down to create this boutique hotel, I think called 50 Bowery. Again, probably not doing too well right now. And the bank, which was, I believe, a Manhattan Savings Bank, is now still a bank, just owned by a different company. So many things have changed and many have stayed the same, but it's really worth going through those images carefully to, for close comparisons. Those are kind of fun. Oh, and you can actually even buy some of them as posters in the shop section of the exhibit, as you can also this mug that Kevin and I are both using. I feel like Vanna White, but please check out the shop section on the exhibit as well, because any proceeds from that go to the center and to MOCA. And there's some nice stuff to look at there. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another section. So another thing we noticed when we were looking at the photos is how many of Bocian's streetscapes and storefront photos really offer a glimpse into a New York that just doesn't exist anymore. So we created a section called Vanishing Storefronts. Now, traditional small businesses have disappeared, across the city, but that even more so in Chinatown as the neighborhood evolved from really an immigrant enclave into more of an upscale neighborhood and a tourist destination, as the Chinese population centers have moved out more to the newer Chinatowns in the outer boroughs. So this is, a fun picture. I don't really know what kind of shop this is, and there's a name that doesn't help very much either. Almost looks like a movie set, and it would be a fun store to poke around in, and not something you're likely to see on the streets of New York today. We also found several bookstore photos among the storefronts, and of course, there aren't too many independent bookstores and stationers left anywhere, and certainly not in New York. That's a business model that didn't survive the internet era very well. And here's an example of a section that we chose to include in the physical exhibit and not include in the digital. So this is a bit of a sneak preview of the physical exhibition. Because as working as a photojournalist for the China Post, Bocian did capture all kinds of incidents and accidents. And like much of New York City, Chinatown was plagued by high crime rates in the 70s and 80s. And Chinatown in particular had gang warfare. So it made sense to highlight this aspect in the exhibit, but we didn't include it in the digital, both because the images were a little disturbing and also because Chinatown was and is going through a particularly hard time, and we're focusing a little more on the positive. But this one on the left strikes me as a typical noir photo with the seedy, dark cocktail lounge and the neon sign and the body on the ground. And this crime photo on the right is actually at Confucius Plaza, which is where Bocian lived, so it's right outside his own residence. And this is a really interesting range of reaction shots in this one, from the kid with the shocked expression to the bored cop and a whole line of people trying to get a peek under the sheet. So again, this is a section that you won't see in the online exhibit. And on a more positive note, there were many, many photos of protests and demonstrations that took place in Chinatown in the 70s and 80s. So we created a section to highlight those, and whether against police brutality, as in this case, or in support of refugees, or against the building of a jail in the neighborhood. A lot of those images really resonate for contemporary viewers. And this Asian civil rights movement gained momentum in the 70s and 80s, partially modeled after the Black civil rights movement. And in this Peter Yu protest, Peter Yu was a Chinese-American engineer who witnessed a traffic altercation in Chinatown. He was just an innocent bystander who tried to be a good Samaritan to, help settle the dispute. And he ended up being arrested, beaten, strip searched. And this episode of police brutality really galvanized the neighborhood. It was kind of a last straw. They felt that they were badly treated by the police. So on this one day in May, the entire neighborhood shut down, and about 20,000 people marched through the streets of Chinatown to City Hall, demanding the release of Peter Yu, who was ultimately released. And you can see in this picture, all ages, from young to old. And there's one guy here showing a power salute. Here's an example of some photos of some kind of demonstration. We loved the pictures and we wanted to include it, but we didn't know more than what we could tell from the pictures. A lot of pictures in Bocian's collection are not labeled, or labeled only with a date, or maybe there was a label that fell off. So in some cases, we had a hard time identifying things, people, places, events. And in this case, we included it because we really liked the photos, but we basically said, we don't know what event precipitated this demonstration. So one of the positive side effects of putting it online as a digital exhibit rather than waiting to install it at the Center for Jewish History is that it allowed us to crowdsource, because there's a much larger potential audience online than in person. And we did include an appeal in the digital exhibit to say, please help us fill in the blanks if you can identify anything in this photo that we can't identify. And I almost immediately got a detailed email from one of the students who took part in this demonstration. And she may actually be on this Zoom, so thank you, Vivian, if you're watching, who told us that this was the Transfiguration School on Mott Street, and the entire student body. You can't, in some of the other pictures, you can see just how long a line of students and teachers this is. Went to protest at the 5th Precinct because there was a class of students out in Columbus Park and they were being harassed by some onlookers and tried to call the police, and the police didn't come. So as a result, the principal, and we now know the name of this principal and the name of this first grade teacher, they all marched en masse to the 5th precinct. And apparently the story had a happy ending. They said it led to better relations between the school and the precinct. So that was a positive. So again, this was an example where we were able to add a lot of detail because it was filled in by people coming to see the exhibit online. So as you may have seen from the Muhammad Ali pictures, Chinatown was really a destination for important dignitaries and celebrities hoping to connect with the New York Chinese communities. And as I mentioned, today the population centers have moved to the outer boroughs, so it's kind of lost its cultural dominance. But at the time, it was really the place to go. And the distinguished visitor in this case is Big Bird, as you can see. The opening for a children's television workshop special called Big Bird in China was filmed in Chinatown. This was the day of filming. When we originally put this photo up, it was basically Big Bird and 4 unknown men. But we now know, thanks to emails, that these are the owners and likely the employees of a shop called Huang Yuanxing on Mott Street, which was featured in the television special and in the interior of which can also be seen elsewhere in the exhibit. So I'm going to share one more of our distinguished visitors. In this case, it was Mayor Koch, closely examining a piece of fruit at a fruit stand. This picture always makes me laugh because all of the onlookers, none of them are looking at Koch or the camera. Everyone's looking at the fruit. So it be like they're expecting some important verdict, which we don't know. A funny story about Koch I came across while sort of looking into his relations with Chinatown. Apparently, he was a very frequent patron of Chinatown restaurants. And once he actually choked in Chinatown, and a nearby patron had to perform the Heimlich maneuver, and that story made it into the news. But the news story said he had choked on a piece of watercress, when in fact it was a spare rib, which is pork and not kosher. And Koch, who was Jewish but non-observant, didn't want that to get out to offend any of his Jewish supporters. So it seems like a really small potatoes in terms of today's scandals, but that was the story, and that actually didn't come out until after he died. So even though Bocian was mostly working as a photojournalist for the China Post, photographing notable events, incidents, demonstrations, etc., he did always have his camera with him, and he really also captured the daily lives of the Chinatown residents. And we thought it was important to include these photos in the exhibit because they're some of the most charming and nostalgia-inducing photos in the whole collection. Everybody loves this one. Of these 4 little kids with their bowl cuts and their 70s fashions, and the fact that they're all on the phone, some kind of staged photo. It also, reminds us of the time when there were phone booths on every corner and pagoda-topped phone booths in Chinatown. Also in this section, there's, pictures of kids of the time, just having fun. So documenting the younger generation of that era. And I was a New York City teen in the 80s, so a lot of this looks familiar to me, though I never threw my friends in a trash can, but I do hope they're all in on the joke. It looks like they're all having fun here. But I certainly recognize the haircuts and the fashions, and I think it would be interesting for kids today to have a look at a slightly earlier time in our city. So here's an example of a section that we included in the digital exhibit, but not the physical. And it's something that we originally wanted to include because it was another area of commonality between the two communities, the Chinese and the Jewish. Chinese groups in New York formed family associations to create a sense of community and offer social and financial support in much the same way that the Jewish immigrants created organization known as Landsmannschaften based around their town of origin to help with burial rights, loans, assistance with a new culture. So we only left it out of the physical exhibit largely for space reasons, which is not an issue, in a virtual environment. So we included several of these photos, mostly just exterior shots where you can see these associations in Chinatown. In some cases, a family posing in front of their association. In many cases, it's not the intended subject. It's a street scene where you can see the sign or the exterior of the building where the associations are located. So again, this is in the digital exhibit only. So those are the main strands of the collection, but the timing was strange on this because as you might know, there was a fire at the building housing MOCA's archive in January of 2020. This is the building in one of Bocian's pictures on the left. It was a public school in his day. In our day, it was known as really the heart of Chinatown. It was the headquarters of many nonprofit organizations, including MOCA, where their offices and archives were stored. So this was a few weeks after Kevin and I had spent some time together in that building, going through boxes and coming up with the general themes that I just discussed with you. And this was 1 week after Kevin came up to the center with 2 boxes, which were really our initial selections for the exhibit, 2 boxes of photos and some ephemera. So potentially sparing those objects from ruin, from water or mold damage. The rest of the collection is now undergoing conservation at an off-site location. So we were working on this exhibition in the shadow of the fire, which was then incorporated into the story of the exhibition. Did you want to say something about the fire, Kevin?
Yeah, I'll just chime in a little bit. So with the fire, we saved about 95% of the archives. Luckily, the fire never actually reached our floor, so it was all water damage. A lot of it was sent off-site to get dried, and it's all back with MOCA now. And so we have it at our new archive space at 3 Howard. But it all needs to undergo archival assessments and determine what kind of treatment needs to undergo. We've also put together an online exhibition about kind of the fire and the recovery process, and we launched it actually on the 1st-year anniversary of the fire. It's called Forged in Flames, I believe, or Forged in Fire, and you can look at it on our website, mocanyc.org. It should be on the top pop-up banner, and it's in collaboration with Google Arts and Culture, and it'll take you through kind of the fire, our whole recovery process, and where we're at now. And you kind of see some of the things. And so most of Emile's stuff should be back. I haven't been able to go look at it, but it should all be back with us.
Good.
So I included this one because it's an example of something that we would have included in the physical exhibition, but could not. Over here, you see one of Emile's photos, clearly an event photo. There are a bunch of spectators, but you can see in the background this Noodle Shop with this glass window noodle sign. And on the right here, you can see it was a pretty well-known establishment in Chinatown for decades. And when they went out of business in 1992, MOCA staff actually went down there to salvage that glass sign, which you can see on the truck, as well as the awning and some other ephemera. And because the physical exhibit is including a lot of photos, we also wanted to mix it up with other types of objects. So we have some cameras from the that the family is lending us. We have, other papers and documents from his collection. But we were going to hang this large glass sign on the wall over some pictures of the same location. And unfortunately, that sign and many others like it were in a section of MOCA's archive that was completely unsalvageable, inaccessible after the fire. So those were lost. It's an example of something that we would have included. And clearly it was too large for Kevin to bring up with him with those 2 boxes. So we had put that off for a later date and then we couldn't do it. So that's gone. And I don't want to end on a down note because MOCA does have a new home for their archive and they've received a large outpouring, of funds and support, and they're doing very well. Did you want to chime in about that, Kevin?
Yeah, like I mentioned, we got a Mellon grant to do the assessment, and they're going to work with us through the whole process of kind of restoring our collection. So there is hope. And luckily the fire did not get down to our floor, and that was just by complete luck because the building didn't have any sort of fire protections. Like there was no sprinkler system. And if the fire did actually reach our floors, everything would have been gone. So it was just complete luck that we managed to save a lot of the collection. And for that,
there was a citywide effort to assist, and I know some of our preservation staff at the Center for Jewish History helped out with that as well.
Yeah.
So I am going to stop screen sharing and I'm going to move into some questions.
Lauren, do you mind
yeah.
if I take the first one? I could talk about the letters and the correspondences.
Sure.
Okay, so I saw someone asked about how many letters and correspondences are in the exhibition. We actually only have maybe one of his letters to Chan, and we have another letter he wrote to the IRS that's actually not in the virtual show. This was actually borrowed from Frank. Frank had this letter. This letter he wrote to the IRS about kind of he owed them money, and it was a really snarky letter. He addressed it to like genderless computer, and he signs it with a social security number, and it's a really snarky letter. And if you come to the physical show when it opens, you'll be able to read it and kind of see like Emile's humor. But in terms of like his letters to Chan, we decided not to use all of them just because it's just a lot of text. So we just chose one or two that kind of tell his story in Chinatown.
Yeah, it's really in the letters that you get a sense of his personality and his sense of humor. So we're really lucky that we have his letters as well as the letters from Chan. I think we answered some of these questions. Did Emile ever marry? The answer is no. Someone was asking, was Emile gay? And I think that had come up in a conversation we had. I guess the answer is we don't know.
Correct.
Where are those files now? I believe that's in a question about the collection, which you answered, Kevin, about they think they're back at MOCA at your new location.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's see. Oh, the crime scene at Confucius Plaza. So we're not really sure what it is, but it's most likely related to gang activity. And I think, like Laura mentioned, Emile lived there, and I think he probably heard it and came down because I don't think they would have allowed people in. So that was in the courtyard of his building. So that's why he was able to get those photos that, I mean, other reporters might not have been able to get just because he lived there and he was so close to it.
How much of the letters and correspondence are in the exhibit? Well, there's the digital and the physical. I'd say there are more letters probably in the digital, but there are many more in the collection that are not in the exhibit. Would you agree with that, Kevin?
Yeah, there are more that aren't there. Just because there's, like I mentioned, we don't want to overwhelm it with just like text. It's not visually interesting, and I don't know how many people are gonna stay there and read through these correspondences. They're more just like kind of you pull information. We pulled out quotes that kind of tell his story, and I think that's what's more important from the letters.
Yeah, we really focused on the letters that either gave a real sense of his personality or included important information about his time in Chinatown, his relations there, and how he ended up there. Kevin, do you think other negatives, photos, materials of his exist in the archives of the other institutions he might have worked for, or has there been outreach to them? Well, he wasn't actually a photojournalist until this point. He was a PR man who sort of fell into he was like a hobby photographer who fell into this job doing PR and photography for the China Post. So he wasn't a lifelong photojournalist. So I would imagine there would be nowhere else to look. What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to look into to see if anyone else had anything related to him, like large collections. People that kind of were at these events had pictures, and someone actually emailed about a picture of like their grandfather, and Emile was actually in one of the backgrounds of one of the photos. But I don't think anyone else has like a large collection of his materials because I mean, they're not artistically brilliant photos. I think they're more important for their historical value. His photographs, like just the scope of it. He photographed from the mid 70s to the mid 80s, and this was like a period of Chinatown that was like it was almost 10 years of a changing neighborhood, and the neighborhood changed a lot between those times. So that was kind of the crux of his collection. It's not so much artistic, which is why I don't think a lot of other places might have any of it.
Can we, the general public, visit the archives and review the letters? Well, some of the letters are in the digital exhibit and will also be in the physical. In terms of visiting MOCA to access archives, Kevin?
We actually are not open yet, but when we do open, you will be able to come in, and if you request to look at them, we can let you look at them in person. They're not digitized right now, so you can't access them online. I don't know when that's going to be though, because like I mentioned, we don't know the extent of the damage to the materials. We're having an assessment done right now, but we had to pause because of the pandemic.
Did he speak Chinese? No, he did not. So he was a bit of an outsider. I mean, he was an insider outsider, but he never learned the language. There's a question, besides the crowdsourcing element, can you provide more details about the collaborative curation process done when selecting items for the physical and then virtual exhibition? Well, I think Kevin and I can address the physical. I mean, it was really just a lot of sitting together and back and forth. And yeah, I'm not sure that we had a plan for the process until we started working together. And then it really came together because these strands sort of presented themselves in a way that made sense. And in terms of selecting photos, there were a few other center staff that, with good eyes who would, our art director and our exhibition manager who really helped us focus on the ones that were both interesting and visually interesting. And in terms of the digital exhibit, that was really, some of the decisions made there were by Sean Naftel, who is our exhibition services manager, in terms of, how to get it to work in the digital format, and made some choices as well about what we could include and what we could not include. So really it was quite a team effort.
Yeah, we chose photos that kind of were historically and visually interesting. And that's kind of what we did. We chose to focus on Chinatown because it kind of showed, like, as we mentioned with the grant, it kind of showed the Chinese and Jewish community kind of coming together. And that's kind of what we wanted to focus on for the show. I also see a question about where he grew up. He actually grew up in Brooklyn. Yeah, and then he ended up moving to Chinatown when he started working for China Post. And as far as
Kevin, does anyone have the archive of the China Post?
So this is a fun story. After I kind of did the initial research on it, a guy came to me and said he was like one of the editors of China Post, and he kind of seemed interested in kind of looking into where the papers were and if anyone had any other kind of issues of it. But when he kind of just disappeared. I couldn't reach him. He gave me his contact information. He just he's non-responsive. I don't know what happened to him, but he's the only connection I have to China Post, as it was, and I can't reach him. So I don't think there is an archive of China Post. We have some issues, but definitely not even close to a full set. And I think that's the problem with newspapers, right? Like even now, people don't usually save them because you don't think they're going to be important, but years down the line, they are. And so I guess everyone watching, if you have flyers and things like that, save them because museums will want them in 5-10 years. They are going to be important. Don't just throw them away. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's coming up on 5 o'clock, so I think this might be a good time to close out. Thank you very much, my fellow panelists and everyone, for joining in. And please, if you haven't seen the exhibit, please check it out. You can click on it from our website, cjh.org, and we'll let you know when we're going to install the physical exhibit, hopefully sometime soon.
And if you have any questions, you can email Lauren or myself. Our emails were at the beginning slide, but
we can put them in the chat.
You want to throw them in chat? I'll throw mine in and you can put yours,
sure,
just in case. And yeah, if you want to get this mug, you can get it on our on the exhibition website. There's a little shop icon there, and all the proceeds help MOCA and CJH, so it's all going to a good cause. And thank you for joining us.
All right, take care, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.